Welcome to the Cinematologists Podcast. I'm Dario Llinares. Thanks for joining me. I'm not going to talk for too long before getting into the episode, which we recorded live at the Garden Cinema. It was a discussion that, in the lore of the cinematologists, explored so many different themes in interesting ways, the connections of which often require a leap of imagination as much as reasoned academic formulation. Beyond that, the event even got me thinking about the very idea of liveness, both in the sense of having to think and articulate in the immediate circumstance of a film's impact, which is as much an intuitive thing, a notion that I'm borrowing from Sarah Cleaver, who was my co-host for the evening. But alongside that, the way that being on stage reacting to a film is itself a deconstruction of the very act of viewing. Throughout watching the film, I find myself thinking, how am I reacting to this? And how can I convert that into something meaningful to say in front of the attendant audience, which I would assume is expecting that? This translates into a performance of self and the anxieties of what one says in the uncertain space between thought and speech. Again, when people are watching you do it. I've been thinking about the live aspect of the show, also because I'm writing a book chapter at the moment on the concept of the podcast space. Space is a term that does an awful lot of heavy lifting when it comes to analysing podcasting, I've found. It relates to the complex processes of producing a podcast, the spaces of recording, for example, and the attendant textures that are associated, say, with recording in a studio or recording in a live venue. How do then the physical spaces in which one records translate into the aesthetic sound spaces that one creates in the edit, and then as a result of this, the kind of sonic landscape that one hears as a listener? And then underpinning this, of course, are the ways in which sound can be manipulated to create a sonic material space for the listener, but then how that converts or is a bridge to a conceptual space, particularly in terms of the processing of ideas. So in other words, you set up a podcast using digital technologies and recording in certain spaces, and you define a context for speech, and then you have the hosts and the guests contributing to what we might call a constructive, productive dialogue, particularly in the context of conversational podcasts that are produced by academics or journalists. Niamh and I have always thought about the show as a unique kind of space for us, and maybe we project that onto our listeners. So what's it like to listen to a live episode when one wasn't there? Is there a sense of entering a space that once existed materially in time and space? So then, what you are hearing, does that mean it's a kind of sonic ruin, an echo which now reverberates in your mind? A few other things serendipitously popped up on my social media channels, which have been feeding into these thoughts. A few days ago, Facebook alerted me to the fact that it was 4 years to the day since our episode on David Lowery's A Ghost Story went out. I consider this one of our best episodes, particularly in terms of the live ones. The film inspired so much debate and conversation about metaphysics and philosophy and mortality, and how we ground ourselves in space and time with a certainty that defies the ephemerality of our existence. But alongside this, it became more important because there was just a sense of being part of a communal live experience, that people shared something together, and the thoughts and conversations were both personal and universal. And I wondered how much of the depth of that raw emotion, which we experienced in the live event. And interestingly, I was contacted by Lottie, a former Falmouth student who was there on Twitter, saying it was one of her favourite nights while she was at university. I wonder how much of that depth reverberates in the recording that people listen to, particularly for those people who weren't there. Then just last week, I was very lucky to be taken by my girlfriend to Letters Live, which is this big production at the Royal Albert Hall, in which a range of celebrities, most of them actors but also singers and politicians, read out famous letters from history and ones that have a contemporary resonance. It's hosted by Benedict Cumberbatch, who I think is a very good actor, but reading interviews that he's given, let's say I've not been his biggest fan in terms of when he's questioned about the class aspect of the creative industries. but he went up in my estimation after watching this event. I particularly enjoyed his reading of George Bernard Shaw's angry rejections of invites in his later life. One that was most affecting was read out by Louise Brearley, written by a Czech politician, Milada Horokova, a letter sent to her 16-year-old daughter before she was executed in 1950. She was arrested by the Czech secret police on suspicion of plotting to overthrow the communist regime. Selena Godden really beautifully performed a letter reading Melissa Harris Perry's deeply moving and personal rebuke to a US Senator, Richard Murdoch, after he had said that he believed abortion shouldn't be permitted even after rape. The highlight of the evening, though, was Miriam Margolyes and Wendell Pierce from The Wire reading an erotic exchange between Henry Miller and Anais Nin, which was a 20th century literary version of sexting that really left nothing to the imagination. Only actors on that level, and perhaps of that age, were able to get away with the content of those letters. And the finale was the former US Secretary of State, John Kerry, reading a letter by American writer E.B. White, which was an epistolary response to a fan who asked how to deal with the pain and suffering that is abundant in the world. Clearly, the message of the letter aligned with that contemporary allusion to keep going. Hope is the byproduct of quiet resilience. And in some ways, this actually seemed lacking in potency. This sense of keep calm and carry on, is a very British thing. And I think maybe a more acutely angry response would be more in keeping with the contemporary zeitgeist. But hey, it was a middle-class audience at the Royal Albert Hall. I enjoyed the event because many of you may know I am into letter writing myself. It's something I've done for a while since I got an old 50s typewriter. I really enjoy it for various reasons. It gets me off the computer for one thing, and it helps me to process my thoughts in a much more linear way rather than the fractured back and forth continual editing that seems to be inherent to using word processor programs like Word. And I think always reading letters that have been typed add a kind of weight that is somewhat lost with digital technologies. And when letters are read out loud, this sense of materiality on the page is literally and figuratively amplified. This event brought back the liveness of the letter, its immediate creation and then consumption, which of course was originally private and between two people, is opened out to define and underpin a spatial experience. Even with the stars and the spectacle of that event, it really was down to the power of the letters. Lastly, the thing that these thoughts coalesced around was the taping of this episode that you're about to hear. We screened Prano Baily-Bond's directorial debut, or feature debut, Censor, which I hadn't seen and really enjoyed, as you'll hear. As much for the fact that it provoked so many ideas, many of which I regurgitated in a very unformalised way in the Q&A. As I said, I was joined by Sarah Cleaver from the Projectioners Podcast, which was wonderful because I think she was a perfect foil for the film and perhaps for my excesses as well. Mark Jenkin came to see and watch the film, so it was great to catch up with him as well. And there were a group of students who came from my film production course at Ravensbourne University, so thanks to them for turning up. However, unfortunately, the audio that came out wasn't particularly good quality, to the point where I've been in two minds as to whether to release this. It's no one's fault, it's just one of those things. I had a play around in my editing software and managed to make it a little better, but there was no fix to the underlying quality of the tape. Interestingly, Sarah sounds human, but I sound like a dystopian AI autocrat from a 1984 sci-fi B-movie. We've tried over the years to steadily improve the sound quality of the podcast, investing in kit and trying to find better spaces that work for that auditory experience that I talked about earlier. But at the end of the day, we are a grassroots independent podcast with no production support. As we've found over the years, working in live venues does produce a wide spectrum of results. Part of me wants to apologise for this fact that the sound isn't up to the standards for the show that I place on it myself. But to be honest, if I'm practicing self-care, which I'm trying to do because I'm going through a particularly stressful period at work right now, then I have to forgive myself. And I hope you, the listeners, will do that too. So here we are, myself, Sarah Cleaver, and the audience of the Garden Cinema watching Censor.
This depiction is dangerous.
Come on, Enid.
I'm cutting it. butchery, sadism, murder.
A wave of depraved and corrupt horror video.
Confusing fiction with reality.
Doug Smart, producer, Ident Investment Films. Maybe Enid could watch my latest Frederick North submission. Wanted a woman's eye on his film.
There's this actress. I've got this feeling that's Nina. You're my sister. You know, if someone did take her, then they're still out there.
You've never been clear on exactly what you remember.
You'd be surprised what the human brain can edit out when it can't handle the truth.
Someone's losing the plot.
I was wondering if you had anything else on this actress. What's going to happen to her?
That's top secret.
People think that I create horror. Horror is already out there in all of us.
Thank you very much indeed, especially to the students there who I solicited for those applause. Welcome to the Cinematologists. We're back live at the Garden Cinema. It's great to be here, and I'm also delighted to welcome my co-host for this evening, who is Sarah Cleaver. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
We watched a few things at LFF together, and I've been listening to you and Mary on your podcast projections, which everybody should subscribe to, by the way. And, you know, it was great listening to you go through the kind of stuff that you like. But I thought this year, when you were talking about that idea of being in the cinema or being around the festival, in between the peripheral spaces and stuff, it was really nice to have that conversation this time around. And it seemed to be much, I don't know if stronger is the right word, but, you know, there was a lot more sort of conversation that took place, because we kept running into each other at various points.
I know,
and I
so
think,
nice.
yeah, and I think that it just reminded me what an antidote it is to sort of be in a space with people and talk, rather than sort of being antagonistic on social media. And there was a real sort of, you know, against that kind of I'm right, you're wrong attitude. People were disagreeing, but there was a great kind of conversation going on.
Yeah, it's true. I think it's really come back from COVID, the festival. And I think, that's just kind of something that happened when we all had to sit at home and watch the films.
Yeah.
I think everyone just got... I particularly I hated every film I watched, and I got really angry and miserable. And it's just you shouldn't stay at home by yourself. I think we've learned that now. Yeah, no,
absolutely right. And I think, you know, there was some very polemic films, and I know you know when you came out of The Whale, for example, we all sat around, and I hadn't seen it. I wish I'd have gone earlier in the morning.
I can't believe you didn't go.
I know, but it's, you know, work gets in the way of these things. But there was that sense of, you know, here is a film that was really emotionally draining and powerful, and then other people saying it was a whole load of nonsense. But it was all kind of in you know, with a good feeling and a good sort of sense of people are allowed to have those opinions.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. And your podcast is coming to the end now of the erotic cinema season.
Yeah, I know. Although what we've kind of found out is, like, all films are erotic, so in a way it will never end.
No, that's it. You can never run out of kind of fetishized responses, I suppose.
Exactly.
But you also run the Zodiac Film Club, which is actually coming here in a week. So I don't know. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, actually. So it's a film club. We screen films. We've been doing it it's going to be the 5th year anniversary in March. And we had to stop for a while during the pandemic, so this is our first Halloween screening in 3 years,
right?
Which is going to be great. And we're doing V, which is a Soviet witchy Halloween film. We've only got 7 tickets left, so
get your tickets now. And you focus on kind of like films of the occult and, you know, and various things, but it's not expressly horror, is it?
No, not at all. I started it with a girl called Jordan ages ago, and we had an idea of opening a cinema in London called the Zodiac that only showed horror films, And she broke it down to a much more manageable idea of starting a film club.
Although we were talking about taking over some 200-seater cinema.
I know, I tried to get you to buy a cinema for me.
Yeah, I know.
Like buy it with promises of like socialism. But that's what I really want, is the Zodiac cinema. And yeah, we called it the Zodiac Film Club. We just thought it was a cool name. We started off doing a film every month, so 12 Zodiac signs, 12 months. But we screen anything that is, it's just kind of it's like, I do it by myself now, so it's just my own tastes.
Yeah.
But we kind of have a bit of a reputation for maybe screening films that have been ignored or not taken particularly seriously, or aren't in the kind of canon of recognised great films.
Right. But that's part of your, speaking to you, it's part of your sensibility, really, when it comes to films, it seems. That idea that every film, not necessarily every film, but there are films that are rejected, but they have an inherent value, in and of themselves. It's not, and the only reason they're rejected is because they don't fit into some kind of canonical context, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's definitely how I've always looked at cinema. I'm not trying to make a point. I'm kind of trying not to make a point.
Right.
Really, but it's ended up being a point.
But yeah, you can't get away from that, I suppose. And that, even when I've read, when you've been writing about sort of being intuitively interested in film rather than sort of intellectually, interested in kind of the visceral experience of cinema. And we're probably going to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, definitely. I think I'm just interested. Just to quote Zizek, I think films are just about desire.
Right.
And I'm interested in what if I have kind of a big desire to watch something, or to watch it again, or to think about it. I just think that's worth looking at.
Yeah.
I think that when we started it, it's 5 years ago, we started to notice a bit of guilt around film watching.
Yeah.
And we just wanted people to kind of take responsibility for their desires a little bit.
Yeah.
To just have a good time at the cinema.
It's really interesting how I think that sort of possibility, and only that possibility, is now completely interconnected with the ideological position of the film itself. And maybe that's something we'll talk about, because we were just sort of mentioning before, that sense of when we watch a film, it's not just we're watching a film, we are aware of ourselves watching and the reaction that we have. And yeah, I mean, it's just an interesting thing. I think with respect to Censor, it actually sort of narrativizes that whole idea of watching yourself watching. So this is obviously tonight's film, the feature debut of Welsh filmmaker Prano Baily-Bond. And the story and theme nostalgically riffs on the era of video nasties, and I know you've been reading a little bit.
I have, because I'm too young to know.
And unfortunately I'm not, but go ahead.
Well, I mean, you can probably step in and correct me, because I've really learned about all of this quite recently. Yeah. I always had an idea of what it was, but it's when VHSs sort of came into prominence. The big studios didn't use them yet, or they didn't get onto them first because they were afraid of them being pirated. So it was smaller, more experimental studios who tended to make horror films that were using them, and the certification laws didn't apply to them. So you're getting a load of really extreme horror,
sure,
just distributed and not going through any kind of legal process. And various organisations, of which Mary Whitehouse was a member,
indeed,
got involved, and it sparked off, I guess, kind of a moral panic about video nasties and what they could be responsible for. And it ended up with a list of films that could be seized.
Yeah.
And that police performed raids on video shops, and there's you should just read about it. There were such funny stories about things that happened, like a policeman putting what is it called, the Littlest Whorehouse in Texas, the Dolly Parton film, in confiscating it.
There's about 31 films that got banned in total, but they had to bring in, part of it was the Obscene Publications Act, but then they needed a specific one for the videos, because they kind of got around that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it's not really. I think it's true. It's true that those films had to go through a process of certification.
Yeah.
So it's a good thing in the end. but it also it sparked off this idea that if you're watching these films that you're a terrible person, or like a child molester or a murderer, or you would, and
also that idea of act theory, that actually watching these is going to somehow rearrange your brain, cause you to go out and cause harm and this kind of stuff.
Exactly, which I actually think is also a really interesting debate, because there's the kind of opposite happened with that in the early 2000s or late 90s. They had a study done where they unequivocally, these films do not cause people to act a certain way. I don't think that's quite true either. I think it's somewhere in the middle.
It's gone the other way as well, though, because there's been studies done on video game play, for example, and it has shown to kind of heighten areas of the brain that are associated with aggression and this kind of stuff. But again, I think that's something that always is going to be under discussion or a debate.
That's great.
Yeah, which is fantastic. I mean, I don't know though. Do you see a parallel with the video nasty era in terms of what you've been reading and what is going on right now? It seems to me that there's much more of it's a different type of sensorialism that we're going through right now.
I think we were talking about it earlier, and we were saying that because what was happening in the 80s, that those people, Mary Whitehouse, who all guys should also read into because she's fantastic. I love her hair. Whatever you think of Mary Whitehouse, I think she was an activist. Yeah. And she was trying to change policy and do what she truly believed would better society. And I think that when people criticise film watching now, it's less about doing that and more about maybe getting a lot of Twitter followers and getting a book deal. Yeah. So I think it's maybe careerism has kind of an effect. I think when we talk about people, people aren't trying to get films stopped or take them off platforms or not have them shown, but they're trying to kind of control the way that you respond to them or what you should think of them. Yeah. And also your choice in watching them means you are immoral for making that choice. But most of those people are journalists. Yeah. Or they have a podcast.
Don't you know? What is it? The Anti-Growth Coalition podcasters we're against everything.
So I don't know. I think the vested interest is different. I think back then the vested interest was to keep conservative family values or whatever, and now I think it's a slightly different. I don't know, I think you've got to look behind people's actions, and I think it's people there's a content economy, a certain type of headline and a certain type of opinion thrives in that economy, and people just need to work.
Yeah, it's true. And part of that, again, is this sort of relationship to horror as a genre and how it's gatekept, I think, in different ways to say, if we're talking about the big blockbusters like Marvel and DC and that kind of stuff, but it is still sort of controlled or looked to be controlled in that way, particularly around, the critique of contemporary horror in association with it being too art house these days. I've seen this argument online where horror should be just schlocky and it should be just this pleasurable experience you don't think about too much. And the problem with contemporary horror is that it's too arty and stuff. I don't know if you've got an opinion on that.
I haven't encountered that until you mentioned that the other day. Okay. I'd never heard of that.
Oh, right. Yeah, no, I think so. Well, I mean, again, this is the problem that we might have on the podcast, where I sort of state that I'm not a horror aficionado, so I don't really mind either way. I think if the film is good in and of itself, within the contours of what it's trying to do, that's absolutely fine either way. And I just think as well there is a sense of trying to connect the idea of or reorienting the canon around particular filmmakers, particularly maybe someone like Jordan Peele. I mean, I've seen this. Jordan Peele is the greatest horror filmmaker of all time. End of. Hashtag end of. You know what I mean? It's clearly somebody who hasn't seen a lot of films would say that. I would say. But maybe we could finish off by sort of thinking about something that maybe we'll come back to after the film, and this idea of the illicit and the pleasure in that. I mean, it seems that films deal with, I think this film is a case in point, it deals with this idea of why we feel pleasure in violence or gore or over sexual content, for example, and how the film deals with that, whether it punishes or redeems a character to give us as an audience member a kind of out. But as you were saying earlier on, that idea of pleasure in film watching, an intuitive sense of it requires us just to emotionally respond to what we see. And sometimes we don't have a kind of control over that.
No, I guess we have control over rewriting why that might have been later.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it's interesting in the case of horror because some people really, really don't get any pleasure at all from horror.
Yeah.
So it's a really divisive one because I think if you're a horror fan, it can be really hard for you to try to explain to people why it makes you feel so good.
Yeah.
Whereas it's much easier in the case of Romeo and Michelle's high school reunion. It doesn't matter how snobby you are.
No.
It's great.
Yes.
Once the lights go out.
Well, we'll definitely have to watch that together. Because I haven't seen it. So. Great. So here we go. Let's get on with it. This is Prano Baily-Bond's Censor.
Okay.
Just a quick break here to say that if you enjoy the Cinematologists Podcast, please consider taking the time just to write us a quick review and rating on your podcast app of choice, particularly if you use Apple Podcasts. That's the one with the algorithm that has the most impact in getting the show out to new audiences. Avid listener Mark Hancock has recently written a great review on Apple Podcasts, saying the podcast description references the host's academic backgrounds, but I found myself as someone poorly engaged with film theory, taking so much from this podcast. That only happens because the hosts want to share their passion and insights about film in an accessible and approachable way, something that comes across in every episode. So thanks, Mark, for that review. We really appreciate it, and it's always nice to know when the style and the form that we choose to produce the podcast in is actually having a resonance with listeners. And also just a quick shout out to John Connell, who on Twitter ranked us in his top 5 film podcasts that he listens to on a regular basis. If you want to go that extra mile, you could become a Patreon subscriber where you'll get access to all of our bonus content, including an extensive monthly newsletter with an exclusive article and a host of recommendations. Obviously, I know times are tough, but if you can support grassroots indie media, it's always appreciated to keep things running. But now, on to the audience Q&A after the screening of Censor. Well, we're back. Thanks for staying, everyone. Where to start, apart from the evil is on all of us, Sarah. Even you, you know? Especially you. That was great. That was really good.
Good, actually.
Yeah.
It's the third time I've seen it.
Oh, okay.
And I liked it the best this time. I think I finally got it. Really.
Right. Well, I mean, we can talk about the ending and, you know, what we really think it's saying, because it's quite open-ended. But I mean, just sort of from a production design standpoint, I really liked the 80s, you know, texture of the film and you know, just some of that. Sometimes it's a little bit easy to kind of play Margaret Thatcher in the background and what have you. But I think it works here, particularly around the idea of what was going on in terms of watching movies back then in the era of VHS. That particularly for me, that just resonated to the point where, I mean, I'm sure I'm not making this up, but I've been to a video shop where I got something and halfway through Match of the Day came on. You know, halfway through the movie.
Really?
Seriously. Yeah.
I think I always had this idea, I mean, I grew up with videotapes too, but I always had this idea that when it's a proper videotape, that it has got some kind of like magic, like varnish on it, so you can't...
It's not a tape, it's literally, there's a plastic tab on the cassette, and if you put a bit of sellotape over the end, you can record over it.
Oh, I never knew that.
It's like an 80s life hack then before there were even life hacks back in the day.
But it's true, talking of, like, you know, sparking desire to watch films, I think that's probably where I got that idea from, because I grew up going to Blockbuster and just me and the video covers. Yeah. And that's probably why, and Zodiac is a really kind of visual thing, you know, we have this like Instagram and it's always about the like look of the film, and I think it must have been from looking at video covers, and it's video covers that particularly incensed Mary Whitehouse.
Yeah. Oh really? It's the covers themselves.
Like,
right,
just not just, but the like the Daily Mail used to put the covers on their front pages. Yeah. Like paradoxically, you know, like this obscene thing that they would just pop and publish millions of prints of.
Yeah. So, but there was something interesting about the culture of watching movies and the idea of there being a kind of undercurrent of something you could get in an illicit sense. I mean, I haven't watched many films, but I mean, I would have been sort of 10, 11, 12 years old, so I wasn't watching sort of video nasties in that sense. But I just remember, around school there was a sort of illicit copy of Terminator or something that was being swapped around, you know what I mean? And it was almost kind of like that idea that you were getting to see something that you couldn't. And it somehow gave it more weight, and I don't know whether it's status is the wrong word, but it imbued it with a sense of power that we just don't have that now, because everything is available. I mean, relatively speaking, in comparison.
I suppose so. I think there's still like this sort of discourse about films and kind of, I was thinking about what happened over lockdown when Megan is Missing became famous, suddenly got a rebrand. And, it's just like a film that no one really paid any attention to, and then a bunch of like teenagers found it. Yeah. And it just, I don't know, and I haven't seen it yet, but it's got this mystique for me. Yeah. I think we can still kind of create mystique and like aura around films online. Yeah. It's just different, I don't know, it's for a different generation.
Yeah, I suppose I feel like that is kind of constructed as a marketing ploy a little bit more now.
Maybe, but this was very organic.
Yeah.
I think. And also, like, Megan is Missing is fascinating because the director thinks he made it as, like, a public service. When it's just an extreme horror film. It's really disgusting. Right. So yeah, that's his marketing ploy. But the better marketing ploy is that a bunch of teenagers found it 10 years later. I'm like, this is the most disgusting film. Right. Watch it. So, sometimes it does happen organically.
Yeah, and there was always something around films like Human Centipede and Cannibal Holocaust and all that. I know I shouldn't mention that, but you know what I mean. It's kind of can you actually sit through? And even Blair Witch Projects was a big thing, I suppose. That was like, people couldn't take it.
But because I think a lot of people couldn't take it because the camera work.
Yeah, exactly.
I think everyone's got a film that they think is unbearable, or they think is there. Like big for me, it's Human Centipede.
Oh right, I've not watched it, so I don't know whether I can, give what's left of my life away to watching that. But I remember going to watch The Road, the Cormac McCarthy adaptation, which is not like not like this or anything, but I really struggled through that. I don't know, I think I was in a bad place. I was just kind of like, I can't be dealing with this. And when there's that scene in it where, I don't know if anybody's seen it, but I'm trying to there's one scene where basically the main character is having to make a decision whether he's going to kill his son or not. Okay. Rather than let these other people get a hold of it. And it's just like, oh my God, that's, I can't take that.
I haven't seen it, but it's okay for you to spoil it.
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I remember screening 7 once, and I showed the end of that, and like, people were moaning, you spoiled it. This is 25 years old. It's a bit late to be worrying about 7, I suppose the other thing, what's really great from a nostalgia standpoint as well, is the texture of VHS. I mean, I remember, that the analog technology of moving backward and forward, and that being something so new, and even just sort of recording something on the television is a new thing. It sounds so archaic now. But even like watching my old DVD collections, I don't remember when DVDs first came out, it was like that idea of this is going to last forever and it's perfect quality and stuff. And you put them in now and some of this so bad. Yeah. So bad.
Yeah, we were like, it's all marketing. It's the same. Remember, like, when it was mini discs versus MP3s and MP3s won, mini discs were much better.
Yeah, well, it's the same with Betamax and VHS. Exactly. Yeah. Or Laserdisc back in the day as well.
But that was actually something that that's what MPs said when they talked about video nasties. They said, like, the problem was that people were going to play them over and over and over and study them. Yeah. And the only argument dissenters could come up with was, well, the quality of the tape isn't very good, they'll wear out fast. Yeah. So it's not a problem.
So eventually kind of disappear in time.
They all disappear.
But there's that Charlie Shackleton is that filmmaker who's making films and just they get destroyed in the playing, don't they? Which is an interesting idea rather than this, preserving everything. I mean, I don't know now on your third viewing, have you got kind of any more thoughts on the idea of what this film is actually saying about her, whether she actually killed her sister or not, and that she's used this way of watching as a censor to kind of not just that idea of protecting the public is a facade to veil her own memories of what she's done because the evil's inside her, kind of thing.
Is that what you think?
Yeah, I kind of do think that, but I think that there is another reading.
Yeah, I don't think she did.
Okay.
I think that, it's all kind of like, it's put together so perfectly, because she has this, this one traumatic moment where her parents hand her this death certificate.
Yeah.
The next day she goes into work, and it's when they say they're calling him the amnesia killer.
Right.
And her, like, just, sort of, the sound kind of dips in and out.
Yeah.
And it's because she can't remember. And at that point, I really like how it sort of made me think as well. I don't know if it's quite the era, but I feel it's the same era as kind of the Satanic Panic, and it's preceding that era of recovered memory therapy.
Right.
And there's that really great bit where she goes into the video shop and says, "So someone's recorded over the end."
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of that's like a clue to what's happening in the film. Like someone's recording over the end.
Yeah.
And so
that's a great idea.
From that point on is like, it's a bit like what happens with recovered memory therapy, where like these things just get suggested to you. And so she just has this sort of series of events where first of all it's suggested to her that someone couldn't remember murdering someone,
right? And
then she sees this film about these two sisters, and one of them kills the other one, and then it just kind of, as everything she sees gets pieced into the
so they're like our memories then are kind of like videotapes that have been recorded over again, and you can peel them back.
Right. Or you can't peel them back once they're damaged. Once you played them over and over again, they degrade.
That's right.
That's actually, I think that is what they.
And then maybe that's the aging process that we get so old, because our memories have been kind of overlaying each other, and then we can't kind of
exactly.
I don't know where we're going with this, but it's great.
We get completely mad.
We've got too much in there.
But I think she just feels. It seems like she has this family where her parents are really angry with her and they blame her, and she kind of has to just take any like normal feelings of aggression or sibling rivalry. Or because she probably, I remember desperately wishing my sister would go away. It's actually called Alice, so when I was little. And if she disappeared, I would feel terribly guilty about that.
Yeah.
So I think, and then so she gets this job. And I don't think she gets this job to protect people. She gets this job because she can't bear any kind of aggressiveness in herself, so she has to have it externalized.
Yeah, that's right.
Basically.
And again, that feeds into kind of the idea of why we watch horror films, or there's that. I mean, they played it at the beginning of the film. I think it was one of the clips in the background, which was kind of like, we need these outlets for our darker sides of our personalities and stuff like that. And that's the functioning of something like horror movies, of why it allows us to externalize these dark things.
Yeah.
And that's the basis of a film like The Purge or something like that, in terms of that being made sort of part of the narrative. Let's have this one night where anything goes. It's almost sort of carnivalesque in that sense.
Yeah, I think so. I think it kind of helps you, like as you said. I don't know if you said it earlier before we were recording, but that it's kind of this controlled environment where you can feel these horrible feelings.
Do you think we're always kind of like that though? We always stay on the side of realizing this is unreality. I mean, we do. I mean, that's. But
I think we'd end up like
exactly. That. But then going back to your sort of podcast and its basis on psychoanalysis. I mean, I think one of the kind of Lacanian readings of film is it allows us. It kind of functions of helping us to repress back to when we were children, when we had no responsibilities. So it's a kind of infantilization process, so we can identify with the fantasy on screen, and it allows us to sort of leave behind all of our adult repressions and responsibilities, which is interesting here, because it kind of explains the total identification. It's like that barrier, that boundary of film person has been completely crossed. But I suppose when we absolutely identify with a film in some way, it absolutely profoundly affects us on an emotional level or whatever, we can almost feel it physically. There's a sense that we become part of it, maybe in our psychology.
Yeah, that definitely. I think it's interesting you said, I actually didn't know that the idea that film viewing kind of puts us in a childlike state, and maybe that's, pretty like, according to Freud, that's when all of those kind of bad feelings, we first kind of encountered them. And, if we have them later in life, we're just kind of repeating the same sort of original traumas.
Right.
So maybe it's useful to be kind of childlike when you're watching a horror film.
Yeah.
Actually, my boyfriend's a psychoanalyst, and I was sitting next to him, and I was going to take what he said and take credit for it, but I can't do it. He said we watch horror movies because we feel guilty.
Right.
Like, yeah, it's like I don't know if I'm going to explain this properly, but what that kind of meant to me was that we're already kind of feeling guilty.
Yeah.
And it's useful to like just have something to project that guilt onto.
Right.
Or to feel,
and externalize it again,
exactly.
rather than thinking about it and internalizing it, I suppose, in that sense. Great. Well, we've got a roving mic. I don't know if anybody wants to make a comment on the film or ask a question or anything like that. Somebody's gonna. Otherwise, it's just me and Sarah. Okay, continue on. Yeah, go ahead. Always nice to be the first one. Thank you.
Thanks for putting the film on. I didn't get a chance to see it when it came out. I was struck by how sort of thematically similar it was to another film that came out at the similar time, same mode. Particularly that ending was, really left you with that same feeling. And her journey was pretty similar. It's not really a question about the film that I have, but. There seems to be a lot of chat that we're going through this kind of golden age of horror at the moment, and I think from my perspective, there's that term elevated horror, which I hate to hear. It's sort of there's been good intelligent horror films made forever, but what do you guys think? Do you think like there is a moment now, either here in the UK or sort of globally, of a kind of golden age of cinema where it's either being taken seriously again in circles that would kind of have shunned away from it, or is it just a kind of, or is it something else?
I don't know. I mean, to me, it's just another part of the cycle of different aspects of film and art more generally, looking for ways to be taken seriously or given the due as art forms. And I think that it relates back to that idea again that we were talking about beforehand about the pleasures in watching. And nobody can account for the way that any individual might watch a film, but I suppose it splits between that idea of something that can be intellectualized and then something that is just felt. And I think the latter is considered something that is unruly, and it's difficult to kind of intellectualize something that you just have an emotional response to, and is often connected with the feminine as well. In the binary opposite to the idea of intellectualization and knowledge and thought and all that, and the masculine. I'm not condoning that, by the way. I'm just saying that the way that those things have kind of been thought through in terms of film studies, for sure. But like all genres, I think they, there's periods when they come to the fore and they disappear. And, it's the same, looking back historically, look at something like the Western, for example, when it wasn't really considered. It's just sort of dime storytelling and Americana and that kind of stuff. And then suddenly now you have very serious, allegorical, revisionist Westerns and stuff like that saying something about the American condition or whatever, So I think people are always, especially with the thing that they're into, they want to make it matter, and intellectualizing it is one way of doing that. I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah, I agree. I think the idea that elevated horror is something we've only just been having is crazy, because there's been elevated horror films since we started making horror films. Some horror films are great and some horror films are just fine. But again, I think it's something to do with the people need something to write about, and that people want to market more horror films and get funding for their horror film. And so it's just something that kind of happens. But no, I agree with you. I think it's the horror film. There's been great horror films for a long time. I think there are elevated horror films, but they're not of the now at all.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it's funny with this one, I didn't find this particularly viscerally, overwhelming or anything like that. And actually it made me, it made me want to kind of deconstruct it intellectually. But maybe that's just because I've got to say something halfway smart. Try to anyway,
Oh, I find this one quite emotional.
Oh, right, okay. Yeah.
So
that's interesting.
Yeah. I don't know, maybe it's the female Avatar.
Yeah, possibly.
Who knows?
Yeah. I mean, there's so many tropes in this that, I mean, it's one of the good things. I think it knowingly plays on a lot of stuff. I mean, with the white dress, or the white night dress, and, you know, that reminded me of Carrie. You know, the static on the TV, anybody who's seen Poltergeist, which I still love. And it reminded me a bit, I mean, it's an obvious comparison to a recent movie, but Barbarian Sound Studio, that sense of, you know, the character is falling into the film and becomes part of the film at the end is quite similar to that. But there's lots of ways it's playing with the tropes of horror in a knowing way. But I didn't feel like I do sometimes with genre movies of today that are utilizing nostalgia, that it's being overly packaged for me, and, you know, it kind of does it in a smart way, I think. Anyone else? Say something. No other comments? Anybody not like the film? Oh, George, go ahead. Save me.
So it's a two-part question. Firstly, how do you feel this film fits alongside other horror films that are about horror films? Right. You mentioned Barbarian Sound Studio, but also things like Ring, or John Carpenter's Cigarette Burns, or Sinister. But then I wonder if those desire to watch or participate in films that kill you is just the trope of doing the thing that is bad for you in horror films, enacting the forbidden desire, solving the Hellraiser puzzle box, picking up the hitchhiker. But then
don't go into church.
Right, don't go into church. But then, Sarah, if all films are about desire and all horror films are about desire, are all films ultimately horror films?
Oh.
You go first.
I feel like I might need a minute to think. That's really interesting. I feel like, goodness. I think, what was the first part of your question again?
That's about a kind of meta, the film within the horror film, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you time to think, because I think I've got something I can say on this. So, one of the things that was interesting about this was there was this moment where it alluded to the idea of the snuff film. And, you know, I think there's always this kind of mythology about the idea of what's real or what's not. And I think maybe subconscious, I mean, there are specific films in which that has been sort of talked about, you know, that something is actually happening. And even now we still have debates around kind of like pornography and sex in cinema. You know, what's the difference between pornography if the actors are actually doing it? Just if you give it a big budget and a really nice story, then, you know, is it still pornography if it's quote unquote real? And I think maybe there is that sense in horror, I think particularly because of the way it deals with death and this kind of thing, that there is always that element of jeopardy that we might imagine that these things are really happening on screen, even though, you know, everything is constructed. And I think the interest then of horror movies that play with horror movies are playing with that meta element, that there is a possibility that this could have actually happened, and that's where the horror lies. I don't know if that makes any sense, but
I'm still struggling with the question. I don't know if all films are horror films, no. I think, I don't know, I think that a lot of films tend to be detective films, if that's like not too much of a leap from what you're talking about. I think that's something I found when I've talked with Mary about films, is that like that's a detective film in a way. You know, I think that's something that's really lovely about films like The Ring, and like actually Bavarian Sound Studio as well, is that kind of because you have characters sort of searching for the truth. I suppose it's kind of like the psychoanalytic process on screen. But yeah, whether all films are horror films, I'm not sure.
But you could say, I think it would be easier to sort of talk about all films being about desire on some level.
Yeah.
Because you're desiring the very act of looking, or looking is a desiring process. You know, there's some of the most famous articles have been written about this idea, of course.
Yeah, that's true. I think, I think that I wasn't totally sure about the idea of like watching yourself watching. And I'm not totally sure about the idea of being this kind of sort of like as a woman being kind of masochistic spectator who's looking through the male gaze at films. I think I much prefer that idea of being a child. I guess children are primarily just desiring creatures. So yeah, if we're all kind of children watching films, then yeah, they're all films about desire.
And it's interesting now because obviously, like listening to you and Mary talk, and I remember in the last episode on your LFF roundup, you were talking about that film that was basically based on the male gaze. What was it called? Which you both slagged off big time.
Something. I didn't see it.
Right.
I didn't slag it off.
But Mary properly didn't she? Let's be honest. She wouldn't mind us saying that, I don't think.
Mary was unimpressed. I don't know why she, I just immediately I didn't want to go and see it.
Right.
I knew what it would be like.
But there is that kind of sense that is out there again in discourse that anything that is on screen that is sexualized in any kind of way is always from the perspective of, you have to treat it through the male gaze or understand it through the male gaze. And there's so many kind of problematic aspects to that. First of all, if it's a female filmmaker, I mean, on a kind of production level, but then, it just narrows the possibilities of what it means to desire or what it means to find pleasure in looking.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think it really sort of does narrow the conversation about what it means to find pleasure in films, and especially when you get to that kind of limit of the taboos and the illicitness of finding things pleasurable, but not quite knowing what that pleasure is, especially if it's something that's society deems you shouldn't find pleasurable.
Maybe, though, I was thinking about this idea of, needing to feel, feeling guilty so you watch films. And so maybe, maybe documentaries like that are just doing a huge public service of making us feel as naughty as we desperately want to feel.
Right.
So maybe that's the thing. Maybe it doesn't really. Maybe we're worried about all of this sort of censorship and guilt. But maybe it's performing an essential function of making us feel naughty.
Yeah. But what's funny though, in the conversations about that, it's very rare that we allow ourselves, again, how to word it. The conversation goes past the point of admitting the taboo of liking something that is taboo in society, right? So what I mean by that is if you go and watch something that is, overtly violent or sex or, something as problematic as rape, right? The film always, or a lot of the time, most of the time, gives you a kind of ideological out. So if there is a rape scene in a movie, then there is a revenge for that, or there is a redemption for that, or somebody goes to prison, or because in a sense then, as a watcher, it gives you a place to go, which isn't kind of like, oh, why am I just watching this rape scene?
Mm-hmm.
I can actually then say, oh, ideologically it functions to punish whatever has gone on before, which then if you open that out and say, well, do we ever really go and watch things just for their own pleasure of watching, just that kind of emotional response? Or is there always a kind of, societal kind of awareness of who might say what? And the filmmakers know that, and we know that as audiences. So then it's very difficult just to get to the point of admitting or, thinking through the idea of just raw pleasure in and of itself, because there's too much around it.
Maybe, I don't know. I think
Sorry, that was really long-winded.
No, it's interesting. I don't know if there's anything to kind of really be sneered at in the pleasure of redemption.
Yeah.
Or I don't know. Maybe it's just kind of a way for us to get some kind of closure.
Yeah.
To a film.
But even like we were talking about before, like the simple idea of that, if you have a sex scene in a movie, it has to be placed because it fits into the narrative somehow. It can't just be there for its own sake. Because there was a lot of argument about this again, social media is a lot of else for everything. But it's an interesting idea, isn't it? It's the idea that, so if the sex scene, whatever that looks like, is not connected to the plot and is just there for pleasure, you're simply saying, yeah, here's the pleasure, watch that, right? And that's therefore valuable, or whatever word you want to use, in and of itself. It's we go to see that thing. But putting it in the plot then gives you a a way to say, oh, it was part of the plot, so it's okay that it was there, which I think is...
I suppose so. I suppose it's the debate of a well-constructed movie versus pure experimentation.
Yeah, I guess so.
Both of which are kind of quite valid in cinema, I suppose.
I think they're definitely both valid. But it's interesting that I think like that argument of why have you got that sex scene there if it's not serving a function, let's say, for the film as a whole.
Maybe it doesn't serve the function that you know, narrative isn't the only function.
That's right. That's what I would agree with.
Top mark.
Yeah. Well done. Tick. Sorry. Any other comments that anybody wants to make? Yeah, go ahead.
The word that came to my mind when you were talking about that is gratuitous.
Right. And
I think that's a concept that's done a lot of work in the history of censorship, film censorship. And it's the sort of quite funny bit early in the film that they're arguing about whether something is gratuitous or not. I mean, how do you make that call? In a film like the kind of films they're watching? What does it mean for something to be gratuitous? It just shows how prudishness is so powerful. The idea that if you're going to show sex, rape, violence, that it has to serve some kind of higher purpose. Otherwise, there's something really terrible going on.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with that, and I think it links to what we sort of talked about before about that having to be made clear about why something is there, because it does serve some higher purpose, and it links to the, you know, maybe the more contemporary definition of sensorialism, you know, that we kind of deal with today a little bit more, you could argue. Any other final points? Or we'll leave it there. Tom, go ahead with a final word.
I really like the joke in the... it's kind of a joke when they talk about the horror directors as like geniuses, because there's always this thing about like taking something that everyone else thinks is quite awful and then this niche thinks is amazing. But also I think it speaks to a time when there was all these filmmakers making all these films, like The Driller Killer and all these films. And then some of these directors did turn out to be like very brilliant directors. And I think it's an interesting point about horror as a genre, about a first-time filmmaker genre, or as a way to get into the industry, because it already has all these things connected to it, and it already has this audience that exists. And it's always a good springboard, and I think it kind of did that very well in a way. I mean, some of these films are also awful, but I think The Driller Killer is pretty good, actually. Yeah. He's a genius.
Well, I mean, I suppose that links to the kind of Roger Corman place in history in many ways. You know, an awful lot of American cinema as we know it, and things that are canonized now come through him as a sort of producer, Svengali, whatever, and just somebody who encouraged talent and gave people opportunities, I suppose.
Yeah, I liked that the character, sort of one of the character of the producer was there, because I think it's something that you don't think about as how influential producers are in horror cinema. Yeah. You know, I like that he wasn't the sort of antagonist wasn't a director, he was a producer. Yeah. It's I don't know, it's just like a nice nod to the...
And great casting, Michael Smiley is always good value. An amazingly decorated apartment, I have to say. Okay, well, we'll leave it there. Sarah, thank you very much indeed for coming on. I really appreciate it. Thank you guys for coming, and we'll see you next time on the podcast.